Lake Havasu shares its borders with two states, Arizona and California. Until 1974, concessions along the California side were on federal lease land. When the Secretary of Interior added land along the California shoreline to the Chemehuevi Indian Reservation, this placed several businesses and hundreds of California residents under tribal control, resulting in a loss of their constitutional rights and for some a loss of property and livelihood. One of these businesses belonged to our family. The brief history of Havasu Palms was an adaptation of a speech given to the Havasu Historical Society in 2005, initially published as a paperback primarily for the benefit of Scott and Elizabeth Holmes and Kevin and Ryan Galloway, the four grandchildren of Walt and Caroline Johnson. Havasu Palms was part of their heritage. It helped shape their parents and grandparents and was part of their early childhood. Havasu Palms, A Hostile Takeover is an expansion of the brief history of Havasu Palms, adding more detail and insight into what led up to and occurred during the hostile takeover of Havasu Palms in 1999. Although we have in essence been exiled from the place known as Havasu Palms, it holds a dear place in my heart. I am a firm believer in recording and recognizing family history and local history. If we don't understand where we have been, we will have a more difficult time discovering where we need to go. Bobbi Ann Johnson Holmes. When many think about Lake Havasu City, Arizona history, it's natural to imagine the city's birth began the day Robert McCulloch flew over Lake Havasu, searching for a place to test his outboard engines. Yet even before McCulloch purchased the land in 1963, people were coming to Lake Havasu to fish and water ski. Other developers came, perhaps not with the same grandiose expectations as the founder of Lake Havasu City, but with their own unique dreams and special plans for Lake Havasu. 6 miles south of Lake Havasu City on the California side of Lake Havasu, just past Copper Canyon and Pilot Rock, is a portion of lease land. It includes about 4¼ miles of California shoreline and was my family's home for over 30 years. Technically speaking, its name is not Havasu Palms, yet people have become accustomed to calling it that. Havasu Palms is actually the name of the corporation that operated a business on the site from 1963 to 1999. Up to the turn of the century, it was still a California corporation. My mother, Caroline Johnson, was its major shareholder. And during the last few years of the corporation's life, Havasu Palms was not affiliated with the property. Before it was known as Havasu Palms, the leased land was called Road's End Camp and noted as such on old California maps. Lake Havasu was a man-made lake created from a section of the Colorado River. On the California side, the Mojave and the Halchahoma tribes occupied land that would eventually be under the waters of Lake Havasu, or its shoreline and the land to the west of the lake. The borders of the two tribes were a few miles south of the land that would become Road's End Camp. The Yuma and Mojave tribes chased the Halchahoma from the area, and around the 1800s, some of the Chemehuevi began moving into the area, according to anthropologist A.L. Kroeber. Tensions between the Mojave and Chemehuevi caused the Chemehuevi to move from the area for a period, but many eventually returned. Within 50 years of the Chemehuevi moving into the region, the control of California shifted from Mexico to the United States. And by 1900, the California side of the Colorado River was open to homesteading. Yet several years later, in 1907, the Secretary of Interior withdrew land along the California side of the Colorado River from all forms of settlement and entry, pending action by Congress authorizing the addition of lands to various Mission Indian reservations. The Chemehuevi were not Mission Indians, yet Special Agent Kelsey mentioned them in the report he prepared, which prompted the land withdrawal. In the late 1960s or early 70s, my mother, Caroline Johnson, received old photographs from one of the first settlers to Rhodes End Camp. His name was Bob Orchard. He also gave her information on those early settlers. According to Orchard, two brothers came into the area prior to World War I. Lincoln Bailey was the name of one brother. They had mining claims along the river, and one of these claims was located at what would become Rhodes End Camp. They leased this claim to J. Flemings in the 1920s. Flemings would be the first owner of Rhodes End Camp. In the early 1930s, Bob Orchard became the new owner of Rhodes End Camp, and by 1934, Parker Dam construction was underway. After the dam's completion in 1938, the mine at Rhodes End was underwater. The one-time mining claim became a fishing camp. According to Orchard, leases were on a year-to-year permit until the late 1940s, when he obtained a long-term lease. He incorporated under the name Rhodes End Camp around 1949 and attempted to sell shares to finance development of the camp. Bob Orchard built the first store on the site around 1940, and he and his son-in-law built the dirt airstrip at the site around 1945. Although it initially began as a practical joke, a pair of pans hanging from a flagpole beside the store would indicate when they were open for business. The road to the camp hasn't changed much since Orchard's day. The campsite is located 12 miles north of Parker Dam, California. The last 8 miles into the park is a rugged dirt road winding through Whipple Wash and is still vulnerable to flash floods today. The Rhodes End mine was not the only thing underwater after the completion of the dam. Because the new lake was wider than the river, shoreline disappeared underwater. Tribes that occupied the area lost some of their land. In 1949, the Department of Interior specified payment to the Mojave and Chemehuevi tribes to be paid by Metropolitan Water. By 1963, the same year Robert McCulloch purchased the land that would become Lake Havasu City, Arizona, a new corporation emerged, Havasu Palms Incorporated. The next year, Havasu Palms signed a 20-year lease with the Federal Fish and Wildlife for what was once Rhodes End Camp. The owners included Noel Kiefer Jr., Noel Kiefer Sr., Homer Willis, Melvin Woolley, and Everett Sickles. According to Stephen Beckman, professor of history at Lewis and Clark College, that same year, in 1964, the Chemehuevi Indian tribe received a second payment for the land along the Colorado River. According to the professor, the Indian Claims Commission rendered a judgment in favor of the tribe for a little under $1 million for, quote, aboriginal lands including whatever interest it may have possessed in the alleged Chemehuevi Valley Indian Reservation on the west bank of the Colorado River, end quote. In the early 1960s, our family took water ski trips, camping along the Colorado River between Parker, Arizona, and Parker Dam, California. We lived in Covina, California, and my father, Walter Clint Johnson, was a successful general contractor working primarily in commercial construction. My mother, Caroline Glandon Johnson, was a traditional homemaker. They had 2 children, my older sister Lynn, and myself. Walt Johnson wanted to build something other than buildings for clients. My uncle, Ken Glandon, lived in El Monte, California, and told Dad about a place on Lake Havasu called Havasu Palms. One of the owners lived in El Monte, and they were considering selling. We made a number of ski trips to Lake Havasu from 1965 to 1967. Once we stayed across from the Nautical Inn, where the London Bridge Channel now replaces the beach on which we camped. We stayed at the motels at Black Meadow Landing and another time at a rented trailer on the peninsula, which is now the island. It was several years later, after the first trip to Havasu Palms, before we embarked on our new adventure. We moved from Covina to Havasu Palms during Christmas break, bringing in the new year of 1968 in our new home. Our home at Havasu Palms was much different from our large custom home in Covina, California. We moved into a 10-wide trailer, not a mobile home. It had 2 bedrooms and 1 bath. We had to walk through the first bedroom to get to the bathroom in the second bedroom. Eventually, my parents put their king-size bed in the only room in the trailer in which it would fit, which happened to be the trailer's living room. It filled the space completely. We would lounge in their bed and visit with whomever was cooking in the kitchen at the time. Before the first Christmas, Dad added a new living room onto the trailer. By this time, my sister was back in Covina, attending her first year of college. Dad hastily built the room, wanting to have it finished before Lynn returned for Christmas break. In those days, there was no phone line, and of course, cell phones were not yet a reality. My father got a mobile phone initially installed in his truck. It was a party line with other mobiles in Parker, Arizona. We had no television, but we had air conditioning, not like the quiet central air conditioning we have today. They were noisy wall units, yet they kept us cool. When we first moved to Havasu Palms, there were about 20 trailer sites. Some were occupied, not all. No one lived at Havasu Palms full time except for us. There was also a campground with public restrooms. The store built in Bob Orchard's day still stood when we moved to Havasu Palms, but with additions. It was a bit of a patchwork construction pieced together with recycled material. It had a tin roof and an uneven red rock porch surrounded by tamarisk trees. The store building had 3 rooms. First was the ice house. Second was the bait room with the water dog and minnow tanks. Third was the store, cooled by an old rusty water cooler. There were gas pumps along the road, propane tanks, and a rickety gas dock. Numerous shacks and rustic buildings were scattered throughout the park, including a tool shed next to the store and an old motel building that would eventually be torn down to make room for the Road's End restaurant. Bob Orchard continued to lease a section of land adjacent to the Havasu Palms leasehold, where his primitive vacation house stood for many years. It looked like something from the Old West. On the lease land there was junk everywhere, old tires, rolls of wire, tools, and auto parts. A junk man's dream lined the road. Walt Johnson had a vision to develop this rustic and scenic area into a family recreation destination. In spite of the litter, it was perhaps one of the most beautiful sections along Lake Havasu. Together with 2 other business partners, 2 other families, Don and Luann King and Bud and Barbara Moffett, my parents purchased Havasu Palms Incorporated at the end of 1967. My parents were the major shareholders and general managers of Havasu Palms, and my father was the primary force behind all the developments that took place during their tenure. When we moved to Havasu Palms, 16 years remained on the lease. My father understood that without a long-term lease, he would not be able to secure financing to implement his development plans. He was told by the Department of Interior that if he hired a professional architect to draw up plans acceptable to them, we would secure a long-term lease, which in those days meant 99 years. They also wanted him to realign the entry road into the park, as part of the road ran over the dirt airstrip. One concern of my father's was the possibility of adding the lease land to the nearby Chemehuevi Indian Reservation. He'd heard stories of land disputes along the Colorado River and did not want to encounter those kinds of problems. Before he purchased Havasu Palms, representatives in the Department of Interior assured him the land would never be added to the reservation because it was located on a public waterway. According to them, it simply was not possible. Unfortunately, my father took their word on the matter and eventually discovered they were wrong. We moved our family of 4, plus 1 schnauzer, 3 cats, and a canary. Our Covina house was for sale, and eventually my parents invested all of their equity and assets into Havasu Palms. When we arrived in 1968, the first order of business was cleaning up the site. Dad was also working closely with an architect firm to develop a master plan. Money was extremely tight. They had a daughter that would be going off to college in the fall, and his income as general manager of the park paid minimal wages. My mother, who worked alongside Dad, received no salary until later years. 1968 was a year of changes for our country. The United States was struggling with civil rights, and the women's movement in our country was sending a man to the moon, not to mention an unpopular war in Vietnam. For our family, 1968 meant embarking on a new adventure in a remote desert wilderness. Naturally, my initial memories of that year come from the perspective of a 13-year-old girl. My sister Lynn graduated midterm from high school that year so she could join the family for her first 8 months in Havasu. Looking back, I realize now what she must have sacrificed to go so willingly with her family. While my parents began the cleanup and worked on the master plans, they had to operate the ongoing business, which at the time meant running the store and marina, the small trailer park, and the campground, picking up the trash, maintaining the water system, reading the electric meters, plus getting me to school. This last chore fell on my sister, who drove me over the dirt road each day so I could attend 8th grade at Parker Dam Elementary School. My mother joined us for the commute, and this took about 3 hours of their time each day. The highlight of our trip was always the daily visit to the post office at Parker Dam, California. Since we had no real phone system, I wrote and received literally hundreds of letters that year. There was no email in those days. While I was at school, my sister worked on the store and did her share of cleanup, using a red children's wagon to collect the debris. Havasu Palms came with its own share of vintage heavy equipment. During this period, Green Acres was a popular situation comedy on television about a city slicker moving out to the country and trying to run a rustic farm with hilariously dilapidated heavy equipment. Ironically, the vintage tractors depicted on that show were similar to the equipment at Havasu Palms. One tenant nicknamed the equipment FEM, which meant fix it every morning. Dad often spent hours each day coaxing some tractor or road grader to life. With the vintage equipment, he removed old sheds, gathered up the large array of debris as he cleaned up the park. There was a dump site nearby, and in those days we burned the trash. There was also another area that was an enormous junkyard. One of the previous owners, named Homer, was a bit of a collector. We came to call this junkyard Gomer's Pile. Eventually, we cleaned up Gomer's Pile and closed and covered the landfill. During most of the winter, the park was relatively quiet. Campers and trailer tenants showed up on the weekends, and occasionally a fisherman wandered in. At times, our family would be the only ones in the park. Easter break was the first big holiday of the season. It was perhaps just as crowded and as crazy as Havasu spring break is now. Maybe more so. My cousin Rod Wilkerson was a college student during this time, and he worked for Havasu Palms that first summer. His parents, my Aunt Margaret and Uncle George Wilkerson, purchased a travel trailer in the park to use for holidays. Rod stayed in his parents' trailer that summer along with another summer employee named Tom Holland, who was about the same age as Rod. It was a fun summer. We weren't ready to implement any major improvements the first year, but we removed a significant amount of debris and painted the store prior to the first Easter. After painting the store muddy brown, my parents gave us cans of colored paint and let us use our imaginations. It was the 60s, so we covered the store with bright flowers and lopsided butterflies. Sometime during that year, my father found an old jukebox stored in one of the sheds. It was a classic made of wood. We put it on the store porch, filled it with our records, which were 45s, and my sister and I kept any money it generated. Of course, it rarely made money because my sister and I routinely opened the back of the jukebox, flipped the levers, and made all the songs play. My mother and one of her dear friends, Aggie Cutting, kept the store open nights during the first few days of Easter week, registering the campers who streamed in all night. The final scene in the Field of Dreams, where headlights lined the road making their way into the ballpark, was literally what it looked like that first Easter. An endless row of headlights moved over the winding dirt road leading into the park. I remember how strange it was to wake up that first day of Easter vacation and look over the peninsula, which had been wide open and vacant the night before, to see it crammed with tents and campers and buzzing with life. The big difference between the crowds then and now is money. In the late 60s and early 70s, there were small ski boats, nothing like the enormous power boats on Lake Havasu today. People weren't staying in fancy RVs, expensive vacation rental houses, or hotels. They were in tents and campers, and it was wonderful fun. Once we moved to Havasu Palms, Dad no longer had time to take us skiing or to use the boat for recreation. For a number of years, he managed to take an annual ski ride doing a shore start off the docks. Other than that, it was mostly work. In spite of the remote location, our family occasionally enjoyed dinner out at a restaurant, when we would take our ski boat across Lake Havasu and enjoy a steak and lobster dinner at the Nautical Inn restaurant. There were no navigational lights in those days, yet we knew how to find our way home by heading for the dip in the mountain range behind Havasu Palms. When the lake was as calm as glass, traveling over the water at night gave us the eerie sensation that we weren't even moving. During the weekends in summer, my sister and I tended the store. During warmer months, we'd wear a bikini so we could cool off in the lake. My least favorite jobs included scooping up water dogs, counting night crawlers, and cutting 100-pound blocks of ice into 4 squares. Some of the trailer people had kids our age who would spend the summers in the park, so there was always something to do and people to meet. That first year we were there, we had company every weekend, so I was never sure where I would be sleeping. Although the area was extremely remote, we were never lonely or bored. After a few months without television, Dad installed an antenna and was able to pull 3 staticky channels from Lake Havasu City. The city was still in its infancy, and it was offering television to its new residents. Back then, there was no road from Bill Williams River to Lake Havasu City. If we did venture across the lake, it was by boat, and we'd rent a taxi, something that Lake Havasu City actually had in those days. During the first few years, we normally drove to Parker, Arizona for our shopping. That fall, my sister, Lynn, prepared for college, and when she left, it hit my father hard. He hadn't truly realized how moving to Havasu meant his oldest daughter would be leaving the nest that much sooner. Had we stayed in Covina, Lynn probably would have lived at home during her first few years of college. I started high school in the fall of 1968, which meant I now would have to meet a school bus at Parker Dam, California, for the trip to Parker, Arizona. With Lynn gone, my dad began taking me to Parker Dam each day. This twice-a-day trip broke up his already busy schedule. By 1969, Dad submitted Havasu Palms' master plan to the Department of Interior, and he received a favorable response and assurances that a lease extension would be forthcoming. As he wrestled with the bureaucratic red tape, he continued to work. That year, he added 12 new mobile home sites and enlarged the campground. Mom was typically the one who cleaned the campgrounds each season, which meant trimming bushes, raking, and shoveling. Sometimes she would have me working with her, and it was always very humbling, for Mom could outwork almost anyone. Lake Havasu opened the high school during my sophomore year, and I transferred there so I could take the boat to school instead of traveling the rugged dirt road each day. Dad promised Mom he would drive me over in the boat. That lasted about a week. I began driving the boat myself, something I did for the remainder of my high school years. It was a 6-mile trip one way, taking between 15 and 30 minutes, depending on the weather. On one trip home, I looked down at my feet to see water coming in. I was sinking. Hastily, I threw on my life jacket, put the throttle full forward, and stayed as close to shore as possible, attempting to make it home. When I approached Pilot Rock, I spied a boat of fishermen and headed directly toward them. After swerving past their boat, I had noticed seeing the man's horrified expression as it appeared I was about to run into them. I beached the boat on shore. They took me the rest of the way home. I was grateful they were there to help me, as the lake was quiet and cold that day. The government also wanted Havasu Palms to realign the access road into the park. Part of the road went over the airstrip, which was extremely dangerous. It took some major excavating, but Dad managed to realign the road, doing much of the labor himself. By this time, Havasu Palms had spent a considerable amount of money preparing a master plan with a professional architect firm. Since my father had abandoned his successful construction company, his only income came from the very meager manager's salary at Havasu Palms. Although the Bureau of Land Management expressed their approval of the master plan, they continually made excuses to stall and postpone negotiations. It became a very frustrating period for my parents. Since they were unable to obtain financing to implement the master plan, they spent their time maintaining the park and operating the business. During this period, Winchell Donut contacted Dad and asked him to bid on a couple of donut houses in Arizona. Our family needed the money, and since things were at a standstill, Dad obtained an Arizona contractor's license and took on the projects. He learned to fly during this time, something he had always wanted to do, and commuted to his jobs by plane. This left Mom alone at the desolate park when I was at school or staying in Lake Havasu City with friends. By 1972, Havasu Palms had improved its beach, added new boat slips, and a new launch ramp. That same year, I left home and went off to college. The lease negotiations continued to lag, and Dad began thinking of other development options. He had an idea for a riverboat store and restaurant. One advantage would be the ability to move the structure if the lease negotiations continued to stall. I was taking photography at the time, so I made an appointment to take extensive interior and exterior photographs of a riverboat restaurant in the Newport Beach area. Dad took the photos and developed a workable proposal. Initially, the BLM gave a favorable response. With their encouragement, Dad continued to work on the plans. But later that year, the BLM informed my father they would no longer work with Havasu Palms for a longer lease, as the land might be turned over to the Chemehuevi Indians. The tribe had ratified their first constitution 2 years earlier, which meant they were now a recognized tribe. The next year, the BLM informed us that the riverboat development would not be right for the area. Whatever hopes my parents had for a long-term lease took a blow. Yet the BLM kept assuring my parents that the tribe would negotiate with them for a longer lease term when the transfer was official. We were living in limbo. My parents were not in a position to pack up and leave. They had already invested everything into the park. We didn't know if the land would be added to the reservation or would stay under BLM jurisdiction. Unable to simply sit around and wait, my parents continued to develop the park. By 1974, my father had added 90 mobile home spaces. Funding for projects came from money borrowed from family and friends. Dad designed everything. He was a hands-on contractor who did much of the labor with his small crew. That year we got the word. They added the land to the reservation. It would be years before we would understand the ramifications of being on a reservation. At that time, we had 10 years remaining on our lease. In 1975, Dad added another 29 mobile home spaces and planted over 300 trees. That year, we began negotiating with the tribe for a new lease. At the time, Jerry McQueen was the general manager of Chemehuevi Incorporated. He contacted Havasu Palms and opened the door for lease negotiations on behalf of the tribe. He told us the tribe was willing to negotiate for a 25-year lease with a 25-year option or a 30-year lease with a 20-year option. Then the players changed, and we were shifted to Pierre Koenig of Chemehuevi Planning Committee, who conveyed that the tribe was pleased with Havasu Palms' acceptance of lease terms and that the tribe was willing to offer a 30-year lease with a 20-year option. Throughout the years, we had been trying to get someone to help us maintain the road into the park. He also promised they would use every means to assist us in road improvement. Before continuing with negotiations, the tribe specified that Havasu Palms needed to sign a release form, stating Havasu Palms would not contest the land transfer, and in exchange for the release, the tribe would negotiate in good faith with Havasu Palms for a long-term lease. Havasu Palms signed the release. Negotiations proved to be as frustrating with the tribe as it had been with the BLM. Initially, the tribe offered a 50-year lease. Although half the term originally discussed with the BLM, my father realized it was a more realistic lease term for a tribe. Unfortunately, negotiating a long-term lease proved a major frustration. Each year, as a new tribal council moved into place, Havasu Palms moved back to square one. Each new council felt honor-bound to come up with a lease that offered more for the tribe and less to Havasu Palms. I remember one year I attended a tribal meeting with my father to discuss the lease, and I was shocked that the council members knew nothing about Havasu Palms or the existing lease. Dad had already been working with them for several years, but this new group was starting from scratch. Ultimately, it took 10 years to obtain a 10-year lease with a 5-year option, a term that was 1 year less than our original lease with the Fish and Wildlife. In spite of all this, my parents continued to develop Havasu Palms. By 1978, a new store in Marina was completed. In 1980, my father began construction on Road's End Restaurant. He'd been collecting used restaurant equipment and purchased red roof tile from a demolished schoolhouse, which eventually roofed the restaurant. After winning a liquor license in the California Liquor Lottery, he was pressured to finish the restaurant within the time frame specified by the lottery rules. The restaurant opened in 1981, 10 years to the day after the London Bridge officially opened in Lake Havasu City, Arizona, on October 10, 1971. My parents always preferred the original name of the park, which is why they named the restaurant the Road's End Restaurant and Bar. Just as they were hands-on with the cleanup and construction of the park, my parents fully participated in running the restaurant. My father served time as chef and bartender, and my mother waited tables and did what she did best. She cleaned. The restaurant was not an easy business to maintain. No food distributor would deliver supplies, and so my father built a large cargo boat that would travel to Lake Havasu City each week to pick up supplies. It was too difficult for employees to travel back and forth to work. The restaurant was seasonal, therefore Havasu Palms provided employee housing. Over the years, the Road's End Restaurant and Bar became a popular local establishment. The party size was commonly 10 to 12 people. Its house drink, nicknamed the Green Thing, sold over 9,000 drinks each season. After the lease was signed in 1984, Havasu Palms continued to improve the park. By 1986, they completed 100 new boat slips, and in 1987, 9 new mobile home sites were added. In 1989, the first real telephone system came into the park when Contel added a microwave dish and my father prepared the trenches. That year, he added a breakwater to the harbor. It was also the year in which Dad was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. We also began to learn the pitfalls of operating a business on a reservation. First, you are not guaranteed your constitutional rights. You are truly under the rule of a sovereign nation. The tribe has the option to change the terms of the lease if they are operating as a government. If they are operating as a business, they must abide by the rules of the lease agreement. They determine if their action is on behalf of the government or a business. It really isn't that much different from how our own federal government operates in a similar situation. However, there is a difference, and that is accountability. As a citizen, we have some measure of accountability. We have elected officials we can go to, actions we might take. Yet on the reservation, we are not citizens, and we do not have the same recourses we might have when dealing with our own government. One example of the tribe's assertion of sovereignty was the tribal sales tax that surprised Havasu Palms around the same time Dad was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. In December of 1989, Havasu Palms received a letter from the Chemehuevi Indian tribe stating that the corporation owed them over $173,000 in back sales tax, including penalties and interest, for a period which included 1984. It was a bit of a shock, to say the least. When collecting sales tax in California, the business normally collects the tax from the customer and then pays the tax to the government entity, like we were already doing for the California sales tax. Since we did not know about the sales tax, it had never been collected, and the tribe expected us to come up with the money. When asked why they never informed us of the tax, the tribe insisted they were not required to inform us, as they were a government entity, and as such it was our responsibility to be aware of tribal taxes. After looking into the bill and questioning the right of the tribe to spring the sales tax on us 5 years after it went into effect, the tribe issued a revised bill bringing the total due to a little over $135,000. Apparently, the first bill included a period in which the sales tax did not exist. Yet the revised bill wasn't comforting. Havasu Palms paid 2/4 of the bill under protest and continued to fight the tax and ask for answers. Already we were paying California sales tax, and we received no services from the tribe or from California. Havasu Palms was responsible for its own water, electric, and disposal system. It maintained the only access road into the park, which washed out each year. In essence, Havasu Palms was a self-contained community, receiving no government assistance. While Havasu Palms could receive emergency police, fire, and medical assistance from California, those services were of little use due to the slow response time because of the park's remote location. We later discovered the real reason the tribe failed to inform Havasu Palms of the sales tax, preventing us from collecting the tax and causing us to rack up penalties and interest. They were on a mission to weaken and destroy Havasu Palms. When mailing Havasu Palms some documents, the tribe included a memo between the tribal attorney Lester Marston and then tribal chairman Christine Walker, dated February 5, 1990. We suspect the memo was included in error. In the document, Marston discussed tribal strategy regarding the sales tax. Marston wrote, quote, "I do not want to give a federal court an opportunity to carve out some new exemption to tribal immunity under the Indian Civil Rights Act simply because a judge feels that the tribe has not treated Havasu Palms fairly. Although it will take a little bit more time, it will not be difficult to grant Havasu Palms a hearing, give them due process up the gazoo, and then hold them liable for the full amount of the tax. This will actually give us some additional time to set up the tribe's court so that once the determination becomes final, we can file against Havasu Palms in tribal court. The tribe can then take the tribal court judgment and enforce it in the local, state, or federal court." End quote. The sales tax never made it to a tribal court, yet it continued to be an ongoing conflict. My father, Walt Johnson, continued to work in spite of his illness. In 1990, he added lights to the rental boat slips, and by this time he had finally built my mother a beautiful mobile home. Over the years, they had lived in older trailers and mobile homes, some remodeled by Dad. This new home was technically a mobile home, yet it was custom built and designed by my father. In 1991, when Walt Johnson's condition worsened, my husband, Don Holmes, and I moved to Havasu Palms. I came first as my parents traveled to Utah so my father could undergo experimental treatment. My husband and I had just completed construction in our dream home in Wrightwood, California. We'd only been in the house less than 2 months when I moved to Havasu. I sold my business. Our children followed when school was out that summer. And in October, my husband closed his business and joined us in Havasu. When my parents returned to Havasu Palms, Dad continued to work like a man possessed. Although he was no longer able to do physical labor, he continued to supervise. He was deathly ill, and some days he would take to bed and we were sure he would be unable to get back to work. Yet after a few hours of rest, he would find the strength to get up and move on to his next project. During his last months, he added onto the restaurant and store, moved a trailer used by the employees, added onto it, and remodeled a mobile home for my family. Each week, my husband and mother would transport my father across the lake in the restaurant supply boat. Dad would then check into intensive care unit in the Lake Havasu City's hospital, where he would undergo medical treatment. In the morning, they would pick him up and return to Havasu Palms. My father, Walt Johnson, passed away on December 10, 1992. Although his dream of a long-term lease never materialized, he was able to accomplish many of the improvements in spite of the obstacles placed in his way. His ashes were scattered over Road's End Camp. My cousin, Rod Wilkerson, who had worked that first summer at Havasu Palms, gave the eulogy at the memorial service for my father, held at the Road's End restaurant. During the tribute, Dad's 4 grandchildren each released a helium balloon symbolizing the release of Dad's spirit. My parents' youngest grandson, Ryan Galloway, just 2.5 years old at the time, said, "Bye-bye, Grandpa," as he waved at the balloon and watched it float away into the Havasu sky. Family and friends watched silently as my father's ashes were scattered over Lake Havasu. My mother stood with her family and her best friend, Aggie Cutting, as she watched the plane fly over Havasu Palms Harbor. Unknown to her at the time, my father had given specific instructions to the pilot on how he wanted his ashes scattered. That evening, Havasu Palms held its annual New Year's Eve party and potluck for the tenants. It was what Walt, my father, would have wanted. Our family stayed on at the park. My husband and I were the general managers. Havasu Palms grew to 131 fully occupied mobile home sites during my father's tenure. It had a restaurant, store, and marina, much different from what had been on the premises when we arrived in 1968. Over the next few years after Walt Johnson's death, we installed a new water tank and pump, replaced the courtesy boat slips at the store, installed above-ground gas storage tanks, and removed the underground gas storage tanks. According to the terms of our lease with the Chemehuevi Tribe, we were required to inform the tribe within a certain time frame that we intended to take the 5-year option. During this period, the tribe could change the terms of the lease, including increasing our rates. As per our agreement, we sent a letter dated May 6, 1993, directly to the tribe, with a copy sent to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In the letter, I laid out the reasons why I felt the rates should not increase. The tribe did not respond to our notice, and we held our breaths waiting to see how they would respond. We sent a second letter in September of that year asking for a meeting with the new tribal council. The second letter was also ignored, so we sent a third in December of 1993. We didn't hear from the tribe until March of 1994. About a year after formally requesting the 5-year option, the tribe told us they wanted to renegotiate the remaining term of our lease. When we informed them the time frame as per our lease agreement for making changes to the option had expired, they were surprised and not pleased, especially after the Bureau of Indian Affairs agreed with us. Apparently, someone at the tribe overlooked our letter accepting the 5-year option, not realizing that by doing so meant they were forfeiting rights to change the terms of the remaining years. The tribe wouldn't meet with Havasu Palms until December of 1994. At that meeting, the tribal attorney, Lester Marston, told Havasu Palms representatives that he would recommend the tribe petition Congress to grant Havasu Palms a 99-year lease and to waive all past penalties and interest on the disputed tribal sales tax if Havasu Palms filed back tax forms and began paying the current tax. We complied, hoping lease negotiations would finally move forward. In spite of Marston's assertions, the tribe did not start negotiating for a new lease in 1995. In fact, the tribe made it clear they had no intentions to do so. In October of 1995, the tribe made a proposal to buy out the remainder of Havasu Palms' lease, yet the tribe's buyout included Havasu Palms paying off the disputed sales tax plus interest and penalties and turn over all assets. In essence, we would walk away and end up owing the tribe money. We continued to operate Havasu Palms and formally rejected the buyout in November of 1995. With an uncertain future, we were reluctant to put more capital into the park. Yet our operating expenses continued to grow. Because of new Environmental Protection Agency's rules, we closed our landfill, which meant hiring an independent disposal company to haul our refuse. We needed to make other improvements to the park's infrastructure. The water supply no longer provided adequate fire protection, and we needed a new well. Electrical services needed upgraded, and an alternative disposal system needed to be developed. We contacted the tribe explaining that it would be impossible to continue operating the restaurant without upgrading the infrastructure. By 1998, we closed the Rhodes End restaurant. We began hearing rumors that the tribe was negotiating with another party for a lease. One of the principals was a past tenant of Havasu Palms, and initially we felt it was simply a rumor. One of our past employees was a friend of this person, and we understood he was living in his home. A man claiming the group hired him to prepare a development proposal contacted us. He complained that they had failed to pay him, and he appeared to be out for revenge. He gave us a copy of their proposal, and to our surprise, it contained many of Havasu Palms Incorporated's proprietary documents such as our expansion and development plans, including drawings prepared by my father. The only explanation seemed to be that someone had removed copies of the documents from our office. Jim Foster, a former tenant of Havasu Palms, was one of the primary parties of the group later identified as Havasu Ventures. Gary Swint, who was a long-time acquaintance of the one-time business associate of Foster's, had been our employee and had access to the manager's office. During this period of the proposal, Gary Swint was living with the Foster's brother, Dick Foster. At one time, we considered Swint a family friend and trusted employee. After we closed the Rhodes End restaurant, we hired Swint to work at the Copper Mine restaurant, which my husband Don and I opened in Lake Havasu City in 1998. Swint suddenly quit, giving us little explanation, and the next thing we heard he was living with Dick Foster. Months later, the man and the proposal surfaced, and the last time we spoke to Gary Swint was when he left the Copper Mine restaurant. Eventually, we met with the tribe, who announced they were planning to solicit leases from a Wall Street Journal ad, and we could submit our offer along with them. Through our attorney, we began working with an international company to develop a formal proposal. After submitting our proposal, we were eventually informed that we were not among the finalists. We later learned there was only one other applicant. It was the group whose proposal contained our documents, and they were the group that was awarded a lease. Unlike us, Havasu Ventures obtained a long-term lease. There was a conflict between Havasu Palms Incorporated and the tribe as to the actual final day of our lease. Our attorney believed it was May 31st, 1999, and they believed it was May 2nd. On May 4th, 1999, the Chemehuevi Tribe and members of the new leasee broke into the Havasu Palms store and restaurant, changed the locks, and seized personal assets of Havasu Palms Incorporated. They began removing files belonging to Havasu Palms from our office, hauling the boxes down to the docks, and loading them into their boats. After much protesting on our part and calling the local sheriff, they finally returned the boxes before the officers arrived. The tribe and the new leasees reopened the store and began selling Havasu Palms' merchandise. Although the local sheriff eventually arrived, their position was not to get involved and told us that we could actively take our property back, and if violence ensued, they would intervene. Our attorney told us to handle the issue in the courts. Even if our lease had ended on May 2nd, the seizure violated the terms of our lease, something I repeatedly reminded Christine Lowe, the tribe's realty officer, during the following weeks. Our lease with the tribe stipulated we could remove our property from the site if we paid a daily ground rent. We had prepaid enough ground rent to cover about 45 days. Early in the initial takeover, officers and an attorney for the new leasee repeatedly demanded Havasu Palms turn over its tenant list, which was a proprietary customer list of Havasu Palms Incorporated. Havasu Palms had leased a tract of land, not a business, from the tribe. The business was the property of Havasu Palms Incorporated. In fact, the original federal lease gave Havasu Palms the option to remove all the improvements if the government did not agree to purchase the improvements. When a business rents a building previously occupied by another tenant running the same type of business, the new tenant might benefit from the goodwill established by the former tenant. Yet the new tenant does not have the right to demand the former tenant hand over a customer list or allow the new tenant to use the former occupant's business name and logo. Yet that is exactly what happened to Havasu Palms. In mid-May 1999, Christine Lowe, the realty officer for the tribe, gave Havasu Palms permission to begin retrieving our property. Yet when we began removing the property, this same individual said we must turn over our tenant list before Havasu Palms could remove anything. Finally, she recanted her demand and gave us permission to remove the items. Days after the takeover, my husband Don went to the hospital with symptoms mimicking a heart attack. I returned to the lease site without my husband, who was still under medical observation, with several employees to begin removing Havasu Palms' personal property. Our former tenant, Jim Foster, who was now one of the new lessees, began harassing me. When we attempted to load a forklift owned by my husband onto an equipment hauler, he chased away the driver of the equipment hauler, telling me I needed to show proof of ownership. It was ludicrous. He knew full well my family had been operating the site for over 30 years, and when I realized he might expect me to show a bill of sale for every item we owned, hundreds of items, I was overwhelmed and extremely frustrated. I called our attorney, and he advised me to leave the park and let him handle the situation. I never quite understood the nastiness of the takeover and its mean-spirited nature. Had the tribe simply decided to give a lease to another entity for pure business reasons and treated us with respect as we had treated them for over 2 decades, leaving Havasu Palms would not have been so emotionally devastating for our family. Yet the tribe and Havasu Ventures relished the fact that they were kicking a 71-year-old widow from her business and home after she had spent almost half of her life at Havasu Palms. They didn't just want control of the lease land, they wanted Havasu Palms' assets and proprietary property, and they wanted to laugh in our face as they took it. When we refused to hand over our customer list, they were furious. After refusing to sell them our supply boat at a ridiculously low price, they seized it, locking it up at the boat docks. My husband and several friends returned days later and liberated the boat. One thing they couldn't take was our liquor license, and for days after the takeover, Foster called my mother and I, harassing us and insisting we sell him the license at a low price, as he needed one to sell beer for the upcoming holiday. Havasu Ventures continued to call the park Havasu Palms, our corporation's name. They used a slightly altered version of our logo, and they began marketing our well-known house drink at their restaurant as their own. Now imagine if Starbucks rented the building for its first coffee shop where it developed its signature drink, and after its landlord refuses to renew its lease, it locks Starbucks' owner from the property in violation of the lease terms, and then turns the shop over to another tenant. The tenant then reopens the shop, calls it Starbucks, and uses a logo almost identical to Starbucks. Then the new tenant advertises Starbucks' signature drink, claiming it was created there, which is technically correct as it was created on the premises, yet not by the current tenants. That imaginary Starbucks scenario is basically what happened to Havasu Palms. Because the lease land is located on the reservation, Havasu Palms was unable to sue Havasu Ventures without the tribe's cooperation. When tribal representatives met with Havasu Palms' tenants to discuss the new leasee, they assured the tenants that no one would be evicted. Havasu Palms would become tenants as it owned 3 mobile homes in the park. About a year after the takeover, the shareholders of Havasu Palms still owned 1 lakefront mobile home in the park, and they paid monthly, timely rent to the new landlords. In spite of the fact the rent was current, Havasu Ventures seized the mobile home with the sanction of the tribe. When the new park management first seized the mobile home, they broke into it and had the locks changed. I went to the park and called the local sheriff's office. The reporting officer ordered the mobile home keys immediately returned to me. Later that week, the officer returned and arrested the manager of the mobile home park, Bill Cotton, removing him from the premises. The district attorney refused to press charges as the incident occurred on the reservation. One thing my father always hated was a thief. Growing up, Dad made it very clear that stealing was something he would never tolerate. When I initially heard Bill Cotton had broken into Havasu Palms' trailer and had unlawfully seized personal items belonging to my family, I was extremely upset. Perhaps the more accurate term, I was pissed. I called Bill Cotton, and I called him a fucking thief. Perhaps my outburst was unladylike, yet it was not uncalled for. When the sheriff had initially ordered Cotton to give me the keys before Cotton's arrest, Cotton kept whining to the sheriff about the profanity I had used when calling him on the phone earlier. I found it ironic that Cotton was appalled by cursing, yet felt stealing was acceptable. At first, the attorney for the new lessees agreed his client would not attempt a retake of the mobile home, agreeing to let the courts determine if Havasu Ventures had the right to take our property. The matter never made it that far, as the California courts did not want to hear a case involving a business on the reservation. Havasu Ventures re-seized the mobile home. At the time, the property was worth over $50,000. Havasu Palms' lease with the tribe contained a clause for arbitration to settle lease disputes between Havasu Palms and the tribe under the rules of the American Arbitration Association. We filed for arbitration, and finally in 2002 an arbitration hearing was held in San Francisco, California. One of Havasu Palms' grievances against the tribe was its total disregard of the terms of their lease when they illegally seized Havasu Palms' property, most of which was never returned or reimbursed. Another issue was the tribe's failure to negotiate in good faith for a long-term lease, as was repeatedly promised throughout the years. Ironically, at the arbitration hearing, one of the tribe's own expert witnesses praised Havasu Palms' management and development of the resort, noting how we had maximized its earning for the tribe in spite of the limitations placed on us. He actually seemed surprised that we had done so well. It left some wondering why the tribe had chosen to give a lease to a new entity rather than rewarding Havasu Palms for its decades of hard work and effort in developing the lease land. While many speculated as to why, I have my own theory. I don't believe the tribe wanted us on the site because we were on the land prior to the land transfer. Many people believe the land never belonged to the Chemehuevi people, and that the transfer was made illegally. It put the tribe in a less vulnerable position to have tenants that willingly entered the reservation. It didn't matter that we tried to deal fairly with the tribe. We were always a potential threat. While this is simply a theory, it is one I hold. Another one of the tribe's own witnesses gave surprising testimony. He was an attorney who had worked for the tribe early on and had participated in lease negotiations with the tribe. He testified that it was never the tribe's intention to grant Havasu Palms a long-term lease. This contradicted the tribe's assertion that they had worked in good faith in attempting to negotiate. The arbitration ruled in favor of Havasu Palms Incorporated. Months later, the judgment was set aside as the government did not feel it was in the best interest of the tribe. Havasu Palms Incorporated was never compensated for its losses. As of 2020, my mother, Caroline Johnson, who is now 92 years old, lives with my husband and me in Lake Havasu City, Arizona. Since Havasu Ventures confiscated the last mobile home owned by Havasu Palms, she has not been back to her former home of over 30 years, to the place where her husband's ashes were scattered. Occasionally I pass the park via water. I can see some of the changes. One of the most heartbreaking is the landscaping. I see no evidence of the 300-plus trees our family planted on the site over the years. Havasu Ventures thoughtlessly scraped the hillside from the restaurant down the embankment to the road leading to the store, removing all the natural flora and fauna, bringing it to dirt and covering the area with colored rock. I wondered, what were they thinking? They removed the intriguing natural rock and desert foliage, including sage, creosote, brittlebush, assorted flowering cactus, including prickly pear cactus, with its vivid magenta blossoms, mesquite, and desert wildflowers that bloom throughout the years, a sight which delighted my family for over 3 decades. Some plants, illegal to transport, much less destroy, are no longer there. It was a natural desert habitat providing home for desert creatures while the human visitors could relax nearby and enjoy the spectacular desert landscape. Across the lake in Lake Havasu City, a homeowner will pay a professional landscaper thousands of dollars to create what was once on that hill. In 2005, we drove through the park for the first time in over 5 years, and I noticed Mother Nature must agree with me. Rain had pushed aside the colored rock, bringing her desert foliage back to life. I imagine it will take some time for the hill to regain its former beauty. When we last saw it, it was a bit scraggly, like an untended yard with intruding weeds. In spite of the negativity, we have many wonderful memories of our time there and understand our future is elsewhere. As my sister Lynn says, we had the best of it.